Good evening, everybody. Can I ask you to find your seats and save your thoughts for maybe the reception after this program, when you will be able to continue the lively conversations, which I'm happy to see going on. Yes, you find your seats? Great. Welcome everybody to tonight's program. My name is Markus Krah. I'm the executive director of the Leo Baeck Institute. And I'm very happy to welcome so many people, so many familiar faces and new faces to the Leo Baeck Memorial event this year. I see currently very active people and people who have been very active with us in the past. I see a former LBI president, Isma Schorsch, in the back. I see a bunch of current and former trustees, staff members, and a number of good friends. So wonderful to see you all. I see my predecessor, Billy Weitzer, over there. I see a former YIVO executive director, Sam Norwich, and I will stop here because then either I will have to introduce everybody or somebody will be offended. So welcome, everybody. As you may know, we traditionally have a standalone Leo Baeck Memorial Lecture annually. This year, we decided to do things a little different because, as you may also know, we are celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. LBI was founded in 1955 in Jerusalem. So for us, this anniversary is a great occasion to take stock of what has happened in German Jewish history and our understanding of German Jewish history over the past decades. And as you can imagine, this understanding has changed a lot over 7 decades because of the historical and political circumstances, which gave rise to ever new questions and approaches to the topic. So we invited a group of really illustrious scholars to help us think through how our understanding of German Jewish history has changed over the past decades, how the Leo Baeck Institute has reflected these changes, and as we would like to believe, LBI has also shaped some of these changes. I'll introduce our panelists in a moment. Let me just point you to another way in which we take stock of our own history. Unless you have seen it already, you can do so at the reception afterwards. Just around the corner from the auditorium is our exhibit on 70 years of LBI and its work, and it concludes in the gallery right outside the auditorium about our current work. So I would invite you to explore this. The date of this year's Leo Baeck Memorial panel was dictated mostly by the calendars of our panelists, and it is a minor miracle that we found a date when all 5 of them were available. But even though it is in this sense mostly a coincidence, it is also fitting that we are meeting today, which, as you may know, is Erev Yom HaShoah, the eve of Holocaust Remembrance Day, a holiday or a day of memory that is observed particularly on the Israeli calendar of civil religious holidays. As you know, the Leo Baeck Institute was founded in the shadow of the Holocaust, in the aftermath of the Holocaust in 1955, to preserve the memory of German-speaking Jews and Jewry after their near annihilation during the Holocaust. And as much as we at LBI insist that we preserve and promote and want to show the relevance of the entire length and breadth of German Jewish history, and that we are not a Holocaust institute and that we are not focused on anti-Semitism. Obviously, this is very much part of what we do, and much of the historiography that we are talking about tonight has been shaped by the memory of the Holocaust. You also may know that on the Israeli calendar, Yom HaShoah is followed in a few days by Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Memorial Day and Independence Day, respectively. And you will all know and experience the complexities and emotions that come with this particular context, which also affects and shapes how we do our work here. So I'm glad that we are all maybe not on the same page politically, but that we are all aware that this is a context in which our work happens, and that is the context of our event tonight. So we've been doing this work for 70 years now, together with our sister institutes in London and Jerusalem, under the umbrella of LBI International, with the scholarly arm of the LBI in Germany. And we're doing this with our partners here at the Center for Jewish History. I've seen, I hope he's still here, the president of the Center for Jewish History, Garth Rosenfeld. We are proud partners of the center here. And if you've been here or if you've been to LBI before, you know that our archival collections remain the living and beating heart of our work. They keep growing, we keep collecting and digitizing. We provide access and support to scholars who do research in these collections, and we offer these resources to broader audiences through lectures or panel discussions like today, to people who may have an interest in German Jewish history in its own right, or because it may be their history or their herstory for that matter. We do that in many ways, as public history, by book clubs, by lectures, by our award-winning podcast Exile with Mandy Patinkin, and in German as well, and by the panel tonight. So I want to thank everybody who was involved in putting tonight's program together. It is funded in part by the family of Marion Dreyfus, descendants of Leo Baeck, our namesake. Organizationally, it was put together by David Brown and his team, Director of Public History at LBI, and Stephanie, who is also here, I hope. So thank you all for all the work that went into it. Thank you all for coming, and let me introduce you finally, the panel, so that we can get started with the program. I will introduce them in alphabetical order, starting with Michael Brenner, who is Distinguished Professor of History and the Seymour and Lillian Abenson Chair in Israel Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., where he also serves as the Director of the Center for Israel Studies. He also holds the Chair of Jewish History and Culture at Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich, and he's the International President of the Leo Baeck Institute. Michael has published many books on German Jewish history, the latest being In Hitler's Munich, Jews, the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism, which came out in 2022. And with LBI, a little while ago already, he co-edited with Michael Meyer the 4-volume series on German Jewish history, which is still the gold standard of that historiography. And he edited the 5th volume on Jewish life in Germany post-1945. Elisheva Carlebach is the Selu Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture and Society and co-director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies at Columbia University. Her teaching and research focuses on early modern European Jewish history. Her many books include The Pursuit of Heresy and Divided Souls, Converts from Judaism in Germany, and Confronting Modernity, 1750 to 1880, which is volume 6 in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. And in the fall of this year, her new book will come out on Jewish women in early modern Europe, co-authored with Deborah Kaplan with Princeton University Press. Raphael Gross is a scholar of modern German history, and he's the president of the German Historical Museum in Berlin, the largest historical museum in Germany. And he has been associated with LBI as well, serving as the director of the Leo Baeck Institute in London for almost 15 years. And he also ran the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, the Fritz Bauer Institute for Holocaust Research in Frankfurt, and the Simon Dubnow Institute for Jewish History and Culture in Leipzig, where he also served as professor of history at the University of Leipzig. Marion Kaplan is the Skirball Professor Emerita of Modern Jewish History at New York University. She's also the author of many books on German Jewish history with a particular emphasis on the role of women. Her most recent book is Hitler's Jewish Refugees, Hope and Anxiety in Portugal, which came out in 2020. All of her monographs have been translated into German, and she has been associated with LBI for much longer than most of us here in this room. She was the associate director of LBI in the 1980s and has been part of LBI's orbit and family ever since. Last but not least, Helmut Walser-Smith, who has graciously agreed to be not only a panelist but also the moderator of the evening tonight. Helmut is the Martha Rivers Ingram Professor of History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, a historian of modern Germany with a specific interest in religious history, the history of anti-Semitism, and the history and memory of the Holocaust. The most recent of his many books is Germany, a Nation in Its Time, Before, During, and After Nationalism, 1500 to 2000. Helmut was an NEH Fellow at the Center for Jewish History in 2023 and 2024 with a project very much related to LBI's work, a study of German towns which after World War II invited back their former Jewish residents and their descendants after they had fled or had been expelled during the Nazi period. Welcome back, Helmut. Welcome everybody on the panel. The panelists will engage in a discussion moderated by Helmut, which will be followed by a brief Q&A period, after which you're all invited to a reception outside in the Great Hall. Thank you all for coming, and I'm sure we'll have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. We are all very pleased to be here, and I'm very pleased to moderate this panel with a group of esteemed scholars who have also done crucially important work with the Leo Baeck Institute. And I was very happy to be a part of this last year when I was very lucky to be, as Marcus said, a fellow. What we're going to do is we're going to start by each of us just saying very briefly something about our interaction or our encounters with the Leo Baeck Institute, and then my esteemed panelists are going to talk a little bit about some aspect of the Leo Baeck Institute that has been of special concern or interest to them. And I'm going to start this out by just saying my own little anecdote, but then I'm going to pass it off to Michael, and we'll go down the row, and all from very different perspectives. So I don't have the depth of your interaction with the Leo Baeck Institute, but I have, for me, a very nice first interaction. And this was, I was a graduate student at Yale University. As a German historian, I wasn't thinking about doing Jewish history. And I did, however, take a class in Jewish history, Jewish social history, with a wonderful, wonderful professor named Paula Hyman, who I've never seen anyone teach a graduate class so well as she did all these years. And she showed me a 3-volume work by a woman named Monika Richards. And many of you know this work, and I just read today it's one of the most cited books about German Jewish history at all. And I read these memoirs, or these excerpts, and I wanted to come see the originals. And so that's why I came to the Leo Baeck Institute for the first time. And Professor Hyman, or Paula Hyman, then said to me, well, why don't you just write Monika Richards that you're writing a paper on Jewish cattle traders? And so that's what I did, and that's how I got to meet Monika Richards. And to me, it's been a kind of an important moment, because here I am many, many, many years later writing about these same village Jews, only in a very different period with different questions. But this is how it started.
Well, thank you. That is nice. And we just honored Monika last year for the English translation of a book that came out in German 50 years ago or so. But I thank you for having me here, and It's a little bit like a family meeting, but it's also a very extended family, so I'm not exactly sure if we get the right tone. So you asked for the first encounter. I guess most of us probably had the first encounters as graduate students in some form with the Leo Baeck Institute. It was the case with me. I came to New York in 1988 from Germany via Israel, and I mean, long before internet and all that, and I figured out once I arrived here, I was at Columbia, and I was assigned as a research assistant to Professor Yerushalmi, and there was an amount of a check which I was supposed to get as a research assistant, but what I didn't realize back in Germany is that that was not a monthly check, but a semester check. So I figured out I need more income to survive in New York. And Professor Yerushalmi said, well, you want to do German Jewish history, you know German, why don't you go to the Leo Baeck Institute? I'm sure they might need you. And that was my, that's how I started to work. My first boss is here too, Frank Mecklenburg, who taught me computers. And I worked on the memoir collection, which we then started to digitize. It was early, but indexing it and all that. So that was my first connection to Leo Baeck Institute. And then over the years, I moved back to Germany in the late 90s, and then was asked to lead this German branch, the Wissenschaftliche Arbeitsgemeinschaft, after Rürup retired, and became more involved. Also, my first publication in a scholarly journal was in the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook. That was part of my master's thesis. So I think the Leo Baeck Institute, of course, back then on the Upper East Side, really became my second home in a way in New York City and in the intellectual world. I think I'm supposed to say a few words about not so much the history of the Institute. There are others in the room, certainly Ismar Schorsch and many others who know that history much longer and much better. The Institute was founded 70 years ago in Jerusalem, and many famous names were associated with it, just mentioning names like Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, but also Hannah Arendt and others. And the Institute was founded really with the purpose of keeping the heritage, the intellectual, the spiritual heritage of German speaking, not just German, but German speaking Jews from Prague to Vienna to Bukovina, wherever, to Germany alive. And the mission in the beginning was really more focused on the period after the early modern period. So after Enlightenment, starting with the Enlightenment, Moses Mendelssohn, and in a way limited to the destruction of this kind of German-speaking Jewry, 1933, 1938, wherever, depends where you are. It was expanded later, and I think Marion might say a few sentences about the 1980s when you were, I think, at the Berlin conference where part of that started. First to the period from 1933 to 1945, and then also post-45. And I was, as Marcus mentioned, I was lucky enough to be involved in this 4-volume project, which was called German Jewish History in Modern Times, but there were like, I think at least 150 pages on the Middle Ages, and then a whole page on, and then a whole section on the early modern, a whole volume. The first volume was really the early modern period. So that already was a change. And once this was done, the next, and I'm just giving bits and pieces we can discuss or go more into detail later, we realized that, well, yes, the kind of German Jewish history as we knew it ended in Germany in 1945, but there was a new German Jewish community in Germany after 1945. And the period already, when we started thinking about this in the early 2000s, was a longer period than Imperial Germany and certainly Weimar Germany. So then grew what we call the fifth volume, A History of German Jews after 1945 in Germany. And another volume where Monica was involved with was an everyday history of German Jews, and I'm sure you can say more about it. And my last sentence, and the current major project, where both of us are involved as well, is a history of the German Jewish diaspora. So these are all the larger projects of where all of the Leo Baeck Institutes, London, Jerusalem, New York, and the German part are involved with.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have a little bit of a similar story, which is I was looking for a dissertation topic, and my professor, Fritz Stern, said, and I said I didn't want to go to spend a lot of time in Europe. And he said, well, have you ever been to the Leo Baeck Institute? And I said, no, what's that? And he said, it's a library and archive on German Jewish history. And I said, oh, my parents are German Jews. And it was like something just hit me over the head, like, oh my God, this is something I might really, know something about and want to know more about. So that's how I came here. And then I want to just read what I typed up the other day. I came to the LBI in the early 1970s, climbed the circular staircase at 73rd Street, around which photographs depicted dozens of male German Jewish Nobel Prize winners and writers. And I wondered if I even belonged there. When I met Mr. Galliner, the librarian, and told him that I was interested in, quote, German Jewish history, he smiled kindly and said there were already about 50,000 books on the subject. I would have to refine my research. Well, I did, focusing on the social history of German Jewish women and challenging historians of German Jewry to broaden their lenses to use women's studies and later gender. The synergy created by a growing cohort of female graduate students and the feminist movement raised new issues for scholars. How did gender, an essential component of social relationships based on perceived differences, shape human experiences? This originally met with friendly condescension. Ernst Hamburger, a stalwart of the LBI and a PhD in history, was the notable exception. My first lecture at the LBI in 1976 was delivered to the Women's Auxiliary, with Dr. Hamburger, the only male in the audience. Although the history of Jewish men had always been seen as Jewish history, it would take some years before Jewish women's history would be accepted as Jewish history, not segregated as women's history for the Women's Auxiliary. Much later, when asked to write about, quote, future research in the LBI yearbook of 2000, I predicted that research in the first decade of the new millennium will continue to use gender as a crucial analytical tool, as it also begins to investigate its more far-reaching implications. For tonight's event, I looked back to see if this had actually happened, and it had. In the 1980s, there was one article on the topic. In the 1990s, 4 articles. And since 2000, too many to count. Moreover, social history took on greater importance in those later years as well. At an event, LBI event a few months ago, Stephanie Fisher introduced her book on Jewish cattle dealers to a large audience. The LBI had come full circle from honoring the Nobel Prize winners to recognizing the ordinary Jews who made up most of German Jewish history. To its credit, and that of an increasingly open-minded Fred Grubel, the director who led it from 1970 until 1994, the LBI has come a long way. I wanted to just add that one of the ways I was integrated into the LBI was through what they then had as what was called their faculty seminar. And the faculty seminar was made up of faculty, and I was still a graduate student. And I wanted to go there because I wanted to learn. But it wasn't clear that the elders were going to let me in. But Ismar Schorsch did. He invited me, and I participated, and it made a big difference in my academic trajectory. So thank you, Ismar, wherever you are. Elisheva, it's your turn.
Okay, so thank you for that, my predecessors on the stage. Some of these reminiscences I have points of contact with, but the fact of the matter is that I started my academic career as a historian of the Sephardic rabbinate. And then for my second project, I wanted to run as far away from those experiences in where the first project meant going to Jerusalem to institutes that specialized in so-called Oriental Jewry. They were open when the archivists felt like opening them. They brought you the things that they thought were on your level and you deserved to see. And they stood over you, watching you copy certain things so that you didn't copy the sources that they wanted to work on. This was my first experience in an archive. And then coming to 73rd Street to work on my next project, which was really what I would call pushing the margins in certain ways. It was looking at the life stories of converts out of Judaism from about 1500 to 1750 in German lands. And what I had discovered is that these were all people, mostly men, a handful of women, who had grown up in Jewish homes, who had very strong memories and reminiscences of their Jewish pasts, and that they had something to contribute to our understanding of what happened later in German Jewish history. So that was my reason for coming to the LBI. I must say I was terrified by how formal it was, but also to this day, I am so grateful to the archivists, to the people who opened up their hearts to me and allowed me to do that work, even though I was something of an interloper. And I just want to read one line from the website. Excuse me? One line from the website of the yearbook of the Leo Baeck Institute, which says it was founded in 1955 to carry out research into the history of German-speaking Jewry from the period of its integration into European life. And my argument tonight is going to be that Jews in any period living in German lands were always integrated to some degree or another into German life. The question is just what that degree was. And that's something we could talk about a little bit later.
Yes, let me also first start to thank the Leo Baeck Institute for inviting me and bringing me here to New York for 2 occasions. Yes, I think my encounter with Leo Baeck was a bit similar to Michael Brenner. We also met at various events, seminars organized by the WAG, the Wissenschaftliche Arbeitsgemeinschaft of the Leo Baeck Institute in Germany. And that was very nice because they financed my trips from Israel, where I wrote a PhD on Carl Schmitt, to Germany. So that's how I came to the Leo Baeck circle. So you can see from my original research, it has more to do with anti-Semitism than really with German Jewish history. And I only gradually then also started working in this field. And I also have the privilege of already having heard all of you. I think before we spoke about the idea if anti-Semitism and the Holocaust was somehow not part of the research of the Leo Baeck Institute. And in a way, I think it always was too. it officially always said it was not, but in the end it was from the beginning. And that's actually also true, Marion, I think, for from the point of, it's true, gender history came much later. When I was editor of the yearbook from 2001 onwards, we had many, as you've said. But I think social history of the German-speaking Jews who were not geniuses really started from the very beginning. I mean, that would be wrong to think that it only focused really on intellectuals of German Jewish history. It was always very much focused also on social history, on education, on every types of, but it did not have the same categories that we now have later. Now, I have become director of the Leo Baeck Institute in 2001 in London. And when I was asked to be on this panel, I was thinking what was actually the core of this institute during those nearly 15 years I was director of. And of course, I inherited a lot because the founding generation was still more or less there. Robert Welch was no longer there, but his desk was still there in the middle of my room. And Arno Pauker was there, Peter Pulzer, John Granville. And when I was thinking of what their approach to German Jewish history was and how it also influenced me, I would say it's very interesting. I think all the institutes are different, but there, first of all, they saw this as a scholarly event. It was, Leo Baeck Institute was a scholarly institute for them. And it was important that German Jewish history after the Holocaust should be written in a universalistic manner. It shouldn't be written from a Jewish perspective. It shouldn't be written in a perspective that could not find others to read. It was very much also, first, it was something that one thought would only last for 1, 2, 3 years. But then soon it became something that was clear, a long project. And for Arno, John, and Peter, all of them, I think it's very clear they were very secular. Peter converted. Arno was a Marxist, and his funeral, there was the International and no Jewish prayers. John was also, I was at his funeral. At his funeral, there was both a rabbi and a priest, something I've never seen before. And he insisted on this. And I think that this was a very specific way of writing German Jewish history that they wanted to achieve, that somehow also was able to influence German history in Germany. And this was very important for them to meet also people in Hamburg, people in Vienna for Peter, in Berlin, and start having a form of dialogue that was not easy and never was easy. And I think they always try to somehow also influence the German post-war historians, mainly men, male, who were not open for German Jewish history at all. And we mentioned before one name, Monika Richards. I think it's no coincidence that she came from the left. She was not part of the establishment, and she was very open for this. The other one who was very clear in this field was Reinhard Rürup, but also he was also more from the left. And so the bridge between this new form of German Jewish historiography and German history was in a way something that they tried, and not always successfully, and with a lot of also, difficulties. We just read in the news, and I will finish with that, the figure of German intellectual culture after 45, Unselt, the publisher of Surkamp, of the Jüdische Verlagssurkamp, he was a member of the NSDAP. It was never mentioned. So even when they reached out to left-wing or liberal German non-Jews, they had their history, and I think a lot of the members of the LBI were aware of that, but still they somehow tried, most of them, to somehow have an influence on how they see history.
Thank you. This is all very fascinating. I want us to pick up on Raphael's last set of thoughts, because I would like to ask the panel to maybe reflect on how the influence of the Leo Baeck Institute or institutes has developed over the years in its, maybe I should put it, its non-Jewish environment. Now, that's not a good way of putting it. In its environment. And by that, I mean both, we could take it in the direction of other cognate fields or methodological interests, social history, gender history, history of everyday life. We could take it in that direction, but we could also take it in a more institutional direction, how it has affected graduate education, for example, at universities, or how it has affected the work of other kinds of academic and scholarly institutes. You don't have to go along the row. If you have a thought, we can just start there. But if you want to go along the row, you can also do it.
Okay, I think I'll just start, which is there's an American context and there's a German context. The Israeli context, I think, Michael, you can speak to more. The American context was to try to integrate the Leo Baeck Institute into German studies and into Association for Jewish Studies, too. That was easier. But German studies was a lot harder. When I first started going to German studies conferences, there were almost no panels, I'd say no panels, on German Jewish history. And that changed over a decade or so, and it became very commonplace to find panels on German Jewry at the GSA. Maybe a little less so now, but still, it was a successful integration, at least at that point in the 90s and in 2010. In Germany, we were talking about it before, the Leo Baeck did not have a major conference in Germany until 1985, and that was a big deal. Helmut Kohl spoke at it, for example. And that was a time when Fred Grubel, and I suspect the board, decided that it was time to show up in Germany. I found a comment by Ernst Kramer, who was on the board.
Marion.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Where he wrote, "Why so late as 1985? According to Kramer, quote, in 1955, a conference of this kind would have been unthinkable in Germany. Today, it meets with extraordinary interests." And there were about 150 participants. Peter Gay gave the keynote in which he called "At Home in Germany," in which he described mutual understanding during the Weimar era, pushing against Gershom Scholem's accusation that Jews and Germans always talk past each other. At that conference, there was only one female scholar, Dr. Rita Thalmann from Paris, who gave a lecture focusing on women's actions during and after Kristallnacht. Otherwise, there were, as Raphael, as you actually pointed out, there were some papers on social history and on intellectual history. And the nice thing about that conference was it was scholarly, but there were also elders there who spoke about their own experiences. So it was a mix of that period. So I would say that was the first outreach, and there have been many, many since. Other people may want to talk about the other kinds of activities that the Leo Baeck has had in Germany.
I can maybe follow this and follow also what Raphael said. I think Leo Baeck the Leo Baeck yeah, that's the first question. Is it the Leo Baeck Institute or is it the Leo Baeck Institutes? There are three really separate institutes in a way, bound together by certain things like practical things, for example, that all of them get some of their funding through the interior minister of the German government, and it has to be funneled through the institute. So that's more of a technical thing, but it also brings the institutes together. But in what they organize, what they do, what projects they undertake, they have traditionally been very, very independent. And it was actually only after I started as international president, we started to have like a joint logo for all of the institutes and try to find things which more than the name and maybe common projects that bind us together. But I think the way the institutes operate in their respective surroundings, and it's of course not only non-Jewish surroundings, because there's also Jerusalem and Israel, shows for a long time continued some of the internal fights among German Jews themselves. And I think I only got the last taste of it when I joined the international board meetings in the mid-1990s, where there were still fierce fights among traditional non-Zionists who mainly, back then were identified with the London Institute, and Zionists who were mainly identified with the Jerusalem Institute. And in a way, they often continued some of the battles they fought before 1933, I felt. That is, I think, long gone by now. But still, of course, there are differences, especially for an institute like Jerusalem, which is situated within a very rich scholarship of Jewish studies inside a Jewish society, or New York, in a city which in many ways is also a Jewish city, as opposed, let's say, to London, and especially then, as you mentioned, Germany. And I remember hot debates about, should there be a fourth institute founded in Berlin? In the end, the decision was a different one, that New York established a branch in Berlin, but it's not its own institute. And there are historical reasons for that. But there were heated debates about it. And it started, not surprisingly, in a time when in Germany itself, the history, German Jewish history became a major topic in the 1990s, which it was not in the same way before. I would say there were two stages. First, in Germany, there was more interest for the Holocaust, and because of that, for the history of anti-Semitism, and that's how many of the early scholars like Reinhard Rührl started their activities in Germany. And only in a second stage, the question was not so much how did this destruction come about, but what was actually destroyed, what was there before.
So let's talk about what was there before. So I want to talk about several turns maybe in the larger scholarship that affects the way German Jewish history is studied today. One of them being what I would call the archival turn, meaning Leo Baeck Institute is an archive. People don't just study what's inside the materials of the archive, but the larger meta decisions about what should be archived. What is the goal of the archive? Who makes these decisions? How these decisions, we had some discussion about this and other people can speak to it. But one of the things that has interested a new generation of scholars, and beginning with somebody like Stefan Liet, who is now at the National Library of Israel, is the archiving tendency of pre-modern Jews, of early modern Jews who began to keep records, secular records of their daily existence in their villages, in their towns, and in their cities, mostly in a mixture of Yiddish and Hebrew, but these were in German-speaking lands. And these are, in many ways, the antecedents of the modern archive. And I think that's something that we need to think about. Again, what they felt was worthy of preserving. Why did they think that was worthy of preserving? How have archival standards and thinking about what we keep and what we don't, what we welcome and what we say, thank you so much, but we're not interested in this type of material. Who makes those decisions? What are the values behind them? These are some of the larger questions that scholars are thinking about today. I also want to mention something about the turn to what I would call archaeology, the material past of German Jewry, which goes back all the way to things like the museums of German Jewish history, many of which preserve for sometimes hundreds of years the prehistory of modern German Jewry. We can't really understand what some of the rebelliousness was about against religion or against old-fashionedness, the tradition, if we don't understand what that tradition was. So there is a turn towards the early modern. It is a very active field today in the training of graduate students and younger professors who are studying Ashkenazic Jewish history, but German Jewish history in particular, and there are others. So I just hope that we can understand that we have to pull the chronological camera backwards a little bit in order to understand what comes next.
This is really not my field, so to answer directly to what you said, however, I made a lot of experience with PhD students because we funded them. And while London was really an institute where religion as a category of Jewish history was not given a lot of weight because of also the historians who did it. When we then had fellowship programs on an international level, we were, of course, always open for projects also early modern. And if I recollect correctly, it were very often religious students or students who came from a religious background who had the most interesting early modern PhD projects because they were challenging the idea how Judaism in this period looked like from the book, because they could see, in theory, halakha or would be like this, but when you look in the sources, it's completely different. And for them, it was somehow a very existential theme, and they created a lot of scholarship. I think, at least I remember that really started, that we funded a lot of fellowships in this period around 2005 onwards. And then I established, there was this WAG that was only funding PhD students in Germany doing German Jewish history. And then when I was in London, with the help of the Studienstiftung and with, I think, EVZ Stiftung, we had the opportunity to give fellowships to students all over the world, basically, who were interested in German Jewish studies. And that changed a lot, I think, also in the long term of the field, that suddenly we could finance, if you want to say, a younger generation, wherever they are, doing German Jewish studies from whatever background they came. Because the WAG, correct me, Michael, if I'm not correct, in my memory, there were maybe 3 Jewish PhD students. They're all together in a group of maybe 2 of them are here. And I think in a group of about 120 or more non-Jewish PhD students. So that changed a lot suddenly.
Okay, this again, what I'd like to ask the panelists to do is to be brief in this, very brief in this last round. And the reason is we would like to turn it over to you for some questions as well and comments as well. But the one thing that we haven't gotten to is if we could wish for one kind of direction or one kind of possible future for either the LBIs or either the LBI or the LBIs, what would it be?
I was just going to respond by saying these are very, very, very tough times, as you all know. And so funding is a big problem right now, huge. And so I am worried that some of this funding will dry up for German Jewish studies. I'm glad Raphael said what he did, because that's what I was going to mention too. I think the LBI should take a lot of credit for having supported and encouraged young scholars in German Jewish studies with dozens of small seminars where they created cohorts, where they became friends, where they were able to exchange their own work with each other. So I was very pleased with what had been. And now the job is not going to be so much what direction as to whether or not there's a good enough fundraising to be able to support more scholarship. That's been crucial in the last decades.
Well, what I simply wanted to say was that there's a much broader appeal among younger students to study Jewish history in certain periods, and particularly in my own. So yes, the importance of funding is not to be minimized at all. But I would also like to hope that we could dissolve some of the very rigid definitions of what German Jewish history was in the pre-modern or early modern era. It was not only German. The boundaries were not as clearly delineated, not the cultural boundaries, not the geographical boundaries. We need to have an understanding of where they fit within a larger Ashkenazic Jewish world that was very broadly networked. People traveled and traversed these, again, geographic boundary lines all the time in their own lifetimes, in the marriages of their children. Think about Glickel and her widespread family from the late 17th and early 18th century. So we need to understand that it's not just about this small, not so small, but very important geographic area, but that it has dissolved border lines that should allow us to explore in all different dimensions much more broadly.
Just to continue on this line, I think we have to realize, of course, that not only the first, but even the second generation of German Jews in the diaspora are, the further you get away, we come to third and fourth generation, they're less interested in this history, and also not able to read the German, understand the German. And in Germany, it's a very different German Jewish community, which is mainly not of German Jewish background. So either we are interesting for a little niche group, or we have to realize that anyone who deals with German Jewish history deals with questions of much larger relevance today. Because if anything we learn about German Jewish history, it is about how viable or vulnerable is a democracy. What about migrants and migration? And I'm not saying it's only German Jewish history, but these are the big questions, certainly of 20th century, but even 19th century and earlier German Jewish history. And I think once we will succeed to create this bridge from a specific group to questions relevant for many other groups today, then I think the LBI really has a future for a much broader group.
Yeah, I think what Marion said in the beginning is very true, that we are in a situation that with so many changes that it's not so simple to think institutionally. One point that Michael made, in a way modestly, I think it was very important that you managed that the three institutes somehow worked closer together. And when you look at the institute from outside, the interesting aspect is exactly that they are in very different situations there in the US, in London, and also in Germany, in Israel, with very different political problems. But to have such an international network of people who meet regularly and have different perspectives, exactly in such times that we are in, is something very valuable that one should use, rather than say, yes, now everyone goes its own directions because we all have our different problems. I think when we spoke first, the question was, do people in Germany take notice of what happens in this country? Yes, they do. And at the same time, there is also a very big shift in Germany. So I would say, while in the 90s and noughties, this field was very popular for students in Germany, I'm not sure if it still is in the same way. I think it is no longer, it's no longer sexy. It's no longer cool. It's no longer something you want to do if you want to be special. And it's not challenging in that way. If you want this, you do something else. So I think the field somehow has to develop and has to find out what the younger generation finds interesting in this field. So I think that's again something for the institutions, that they have to learn from the young generation what their questions are. That's often challenging and unpleasant, but I think it's very important.
Yes, I agree with this. I would just, I'm going to become a panelist for a brief moment. I think that this is what you say about this international cooperation is really important. And I also think with respect to the German side of this equation, we look in Germany at a memory culture that was very invested in the history of non-Jewish and Jewish-German relations, however you want to put this. And that generation is also graying. That generation is also fighting a battle to try to figure out how to reach the younger people. When I work in these small villages and I talk with the people who are decisive for having their village, their town face the past, I'm usually talking to people older than me. And that's not good. And so I think that also, if I had a wish for the LBIs, I would also be to work with these people as well, partly for a very practical reason, and that is that they have when one of the things, when you work in the collections of the Center for Jewish History, the Leo Baeck Institute, you are working often with people who've given their papers. And those papers are full of correspondences. To my great surprise, a lot of those correspondences were to places they came from in Germany. The moment you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Of course, they're writing back to the places they came from. People they knew or their fathers knew, or when they went back to look at their graves, setting that all up. But what it means is that there is an ocean of German Jewish documents in Germany. And I think that the idea that one might open up the concept of what this memoir literature collection started, to take in a larger still body of German Jewish writing about themselves in reports of experiences, German Jewish letters about their own history back in Germany and what's happened afterwards. I think that this would be helpful on a number of levels, also because I think I'm also concerned about that German memory culture and what's happening to it. So that would be my little 2 cents to this. But what we would like to do most of all now is to turn to you. And I know a lot of you have your own thoughts and your own experiences with the Leo Baeck Institute. And if we could open it up to questions. There's right here.
Could you give me some historical background? Leo Baeck's name is placed on the institution. What was his vision? And has history diverged from what he wanted? Or is he still the luminary in the institution? And is there some second thought about the naming of the institution?
I mean, I can say something. I'm curious about the other things. In a certain way, I mean, Leo Baeck was the kind of towering figure of German Jewry between 33 and 45. And the name was rather used, I would say, for this project because it, in a way, also was a memorial project to collect and to write one big history of what was German Jewry prior to 1933. And so the name was very much used. I think he was still alive then, but I don't think that there was much correspondence. So there was not an agenda from Leo Baeck that ever has been influential for the Leo Baeck Institutes. But the people that were mentioned before, Scholem, Arendt, Simon, one more I've forgotten. No.
Buber.
Yeah, and Welsh, Buber, they were the ones who were somehow drafting those first, I've seen those first drafts of how the Leo Baeck Institute should look, which was actually quite similar to what then was implemented.
I think, yes, I think he was not involved at all in the actual planning. He was honored, but he was a figure even before 33 who was seen as an integrationist figure. He was a liberal rabbi, but he was also what probably today would be much more conservative, but he also grew up Orthodox. He was between those clear camps. He was not an active Zionist, but he was pro-Zionist. He was a religious leader, but after 33 became also the political leader of German Jews. And of course, he stayed with German Jews and went with them to Theresienstadt. So all of these things, I think, he was a figure everybody could live with and look up to. And of course, today, doesn't matter if it's in Germany or in London or in New York or in Jerusalem. If you say the name Leo Baeck, young people and older people too mostly have no idea who this person was. So we have sometimes to, but then,
But there's a good book about him by Michael Meyer. So that's really worth looking at.
Moses Mendelssohn also didn't lay out the agenda for the Moses Mendelssohn Institute, nor did Simon Dubnov lay out in other words, you can use a figure as a symbol of what your institution stands for without them having to necessarily lay out a vision for that institute. And I think that's the case we've just heard.
I think we're also saying that the vision in 1955 changed, as most institutions, I would think, change with the times. So originally, there was a sense of we're stopping in 1945, or first of all, 1933, then 1938, 1945, and we've gone on since then. So I think that's pretty normal.
And we'll take more questions, but let's just one last thing. The plans for the Institute actually go back much further, not called Leo Baeck Institute, but for an institute or a resource for preserving the heritage, go back before 1945 into the Nazi period among German Jewish immigrants who had these plans already before 1945.
There was, I think, a plan where the name Warburg was also on it that I've seen before Leo Baeck.
Hello. So I actually have a question related to that, which is, can you talk about the fight to even get the recognition? Because when I've read about the history, part of the fight was to even get the books, the materials, because a lot of other Jews argued there's no German Jewish history. They were, assimilationist. And so I read that there was like a fight to even get the material for the Institute. Can you talk about that at all, or no?
What do you mean to get the material for the Institute?
Meaning when the books were gathered by the Allies and all the materials from the Nazis, all these different Jewish organizations wanted them from different and they didn't want them to go to a German specific one. They're like, we should send it to an institute in Jerusalem. Like they didn't think that there was a good reason for a German Jewish specific institute.
Yes, I can say something about this. I mean, what you refer to is the collecting points, I guess, in Offenbach and in various parts of the different zones of the Allies in what before was Germany. And it was quite important specifically for Zionist Jewish leaders that there should not be a continuation of Jewish communities in Germany post-45. And so the books and the ceremonial objects that were found, there was a group of people, I think headed also by Hannah Arendt, Salo Baron Arendt, and they went to Germany and made lists of those objects and distributed them to South America, to New York, to Jerusalem, to various places. And the idea was that somehow the Jewish communities do not start again, because the idea was really Jews should go out of this place. And that is very important. And that's in a way also maybe that the Leo Baeck Institute took, I think, until the 90s or so to start really actively doing German Jewish history post-45. And I remember that when I was in London in 2001-2, we started the first yearbook on post-90, on the Russian Jews who came to Germany. That was very late. So, yeah. But there are many books about this. I think just maybe you know
the organization that was the Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, headed by Salo Baron, and Hannah Arendt was active. But that was 10 years before the foundation of the Leo Baeck Institute. When the institute was founded in the mid-50s, it was drawing, and it's a good question you're asking here, it was drawing mainly on the materials the immigrants had brought out. So I would say that New York mainly collected the materials they could get from the US, and London, the British ones, and Israel, of course, those who went to Palestine, Israel.
Thank you so much for the presentation, the discussion. I'd like to ask whether we could continue some of the elements that both Michael Brenner and also Raphael Gross brought up. The statement was made that it's important, I'm now in my words, to focus on themes like migration or the fragility of democracies. And Raphael Gross, you brought up the point about that perhaps to some degree engaging with German Jewish history is not as sexy and as cool as it was in a certain specific historical moment in the 90s and early 2000s. And perhaps drilling a little bit further into that, because that seems to be, for me, one of the most important points of the discussion so far this evening. I might want to just push things a little bit further and say, are we, or at least raise a question, are we at the end of an era? Are we at a threshold where, to some degree, we can look back at the last 10, 20, 30 years with that to some degree was a success story. And now I'm going to mix a lot of things that all are different processes, right? Germany engaging with its past and reckoning with its past. And Helmut, of course, is the expert on some of these trends over these years and different levels of that. The interest in German Jewish history, and Michael, you mentioned how perhaps in the beginning it was more focusing on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, and then from there more came. But in many ways, I'll just venture to say there's a little bit of a success story there. But right now, it seems that on so many different levels and so many different areas, we are getting to some kind of a different transition. Is that the debates in Germany post-October 7th? Is it the discussion about anti-Semitism? Is it the discussion about colonialism and migration and racism and anti-Semitism? Is it about the role of German Jewish experience in Germany today? Of course, I'm aware of these all different areas, but there seems to be some connection. And basically the question is, sorry for the long starting point here, is what could the potential for a engagement with that German Jewish history be in the future that is sexy and cool and that has something to say for the next generation as we are standing perhaps at that threshold?
Well, I could start, I guess, by saying how I taught for the last few years before I retired, which was I taught minority history. I taught about the Holocaust and all the minorities who were attacked. And I had students from every possible background interested in how Jews were treated, how Roma were treated, how disabled people were treated. In other words, thinking in terms of outsiders, minorities. And the other thing is that when I taught German Jewish history, I also taught minority history. How are minorities treated? How were refugees treated? How were immigrants treated? You can start with Glickl of Hamel, if in terms of how far back I can go. You can go farther. But how did that work? And that attracts students. Students are interested in those questions, and they're not just Jewish students. Jewish students, of course, can be interested, but all kinds of students. So I think we might be working in that direction. And my last two books were about refugees, and refugees is a big topic now. And so I think that's another area where Jewish history, German Jewish history in this case, can make an impact. So I can just talk about my own experience there.
I would add just one more word to that list that you gave us, which is identity. How do people define themselves within cultures? It's such a big question. Gender identity, racial identity, religious identity, national identity, and how they negotiate that is something that students also are always curious to see how it worked out and how that can inform their own lives. So the idea is to try and bridge some of what the past has to teach us about what is currently on the minds of young people.
If I could also, I do have a fear that you're right about the end of an era. Researching this, I am always reminded that, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. And one reason why we're writing its history is because this is where we are. And I will say I'm still puzzled about it because when I look there, I do see this phenomenon. I do see the aging. I don't fully understand where the interest is going. At the same time, I teach at an American university, and I also have good classes and full classes, and I can't keep the students away, so they're interested. The question is really what they're interested in, and I'm not sure that we are all going to come up with anything like the same answer. I teach the Holocaust in a very different way. I don't say the word identity ever. I have them research the fate of small towns they've never heard of in Lithuania. And I have them look very, very closely at what people are capable of. And I have them reconstruct it down to, a kind of level of detail that they think that they've never thought they'd actually look at history at. And at some level, this still fascinates them. And so I think that one of the things that I think that was good about the 90s in Germany is that everyone became a historian or an archivist, or, they did work themselves like this. And I think that was something that transformed some places, some people in Germany. But I don't really know the answer, in the end. Just my way of doing it.
What was good about the 90s is that we were all young. And I think that's part of the answer. It's a little bit a natural process. Nothing stays sexy, or you can say fashionable at the same time. Fashions, and there was a certain fashion, and I always had the feeling, a wave of interest, because it was not touched much before. But it's also the passing of time, and the passing of this time period. So I totally agree with you. I think we need, and it's also what Marion said, we need to see where can we connect, which are the topics, and that was the reason we decided to engage in this diaspora. Diaspora, by the way, diaspora history, I think, is a very sexy topic for a while now, but there's so many diasporas, and many people don't even connect it with the Jewish or German Jewish experience. But I think, we have something to say about diaspora. So I hope that this project will raise a lot of interest. And I think one really, just to give an example of something that I think was very successful, although Marcus can probably say more about it, was the podcast project, Exile. I think it's marvelous, things wonderfully done, and it speaks also to a younger generation. I don't know who listens to it, but it's certainly something in a good direction.